The world remembers Alcatraz as a prison that was too costly to maintain. That's the story carved into history books, a neat line in government reports. Closed in 1963, structural decay, financial drain, nothing more. But anyone who's ever set foot on the island, they'll tell you the truth is heavier, colder, sharper than stone, because Alcatraz wasn't built just to contain men. It was built to contain something else. Every prison has its ghosts, but Alcatraz had its howls. Guards swore they heard claws raking against concrete. Inmates whispered that the moonlight through barred windows made some men change. At first it was just rumors, chalked up to madness, to fear. But by the final years the guards carried more than batons. Some carried silver knives, some never left their cells at night, and some disappeared entirely. The island was a fortress, surrounded by water so frigid it could kill a man before the current dragged him under. A place designed to break spirits and bend wills. But even the sea couldn't wash away the stains left behind after a full moon. On official records, the last escape attempt is a tale of men trying to flee the rock, never to be seen again. But what if they didn't drown? What if what hunted them that night was far worse than the Pacific? Alcatraz closed because the truth became impossible to hide. The screams grew louder, the transformations less contained, and the government, rather than admit they had unleashed something monstrous on American soil, sealed it shut and threw away the key. Yet the howls have never stopped. Fishermen claim that on certain nights, when the fog is thick and the moon is full, you can still hear them echoing across the bay, bouncing off the water, carried by a curse that never died. This is the story of Alcatraz as it was meant to be told. Not the prison of men, but the prison of monsters. And once you know why they really closed it, you'll understand why no one dares set foot there when the night is bright and the tide is high. The ferry to Alcatraz was no ordinary transfer. It was a ritual. Shackled men stared across the black water, their eyes hollow, their wrists raw. Behind them, the guards wore expressions carved from stone, but even they refused to meet the inmates' gaze. They knew something the prisoners didn't. Every man sent to the rock believed it was just another prison, another concrete coffin. But Alcatraz was different. The moment the island rose from the fog, framed by gulls and a gray sky, dread set in. The air itself felt charged, metallic, almost as if the salt carried whispers too faint to catch. The intake process was brutal. Metal doors groaned. Boots struck hollow floors. Prisoners were stripped, washed, numbered, and thrown into cells barely wider than their own bodies. They weren't men anymore. They were animals in cages, and for some, that was closer to the truth than they realized. One guard, older than the rest, had a scar running across his throat. He whispered to the new arrivals in a rasping voice, warning them, "You'll learn the rules. Stay in your cell at night. Don't look at the moon. And if you hear claws, pray." The others laughed, calling him superstitious. But the laughter always died when the lights went out. The first night was the worst. The cells were so cold that breath rose like smoke. In the silence, every noise was amplified. Chains clinking, water dripping, the wind shrieking through cracks. But beneath it all was something else. A scratching, a pacing. Heavy breaths that didn't belong to any man. Alcatraz didn't just break spirits. It fed on them. The guards claimed it was the isolation, the cruelty, the endless sea that made men lose their minds. But prisoners knew better. They felt it in their bones. They saw it in the way some men twitched when the moonlight crept across the floor. Their eyes gleamed in unnatural ways. Their teeth looked sharper in the half-light. And then, without fail, the guards would make their rounds carrying strange weapons. Not batons, not rifles. Silver-polished knives tucked into belts, crosses around their necks, salt scattered at the thresholds. None of it made sense to the new inmates. Not yet, but soon they would understand. Alcatraz was not a place you survived. It was a place you were consumed. The older prisoners spoke, in low voices through the bars, trading stories of nights when the howling started. They said the guards didn't stop fights because the real fights weren't between inmates. They were between men and something else. Arrival wasn't the beginning of a sentence, it was the beginning of a hunt. The nights on Alcatraz had a rhythm. Boots marched, keys rattled, men whispered into the dark. But on the third night of the intake, that rhythm shattered. It started as a cough, guttural, raw, like a man choking on his own throat. Prisoners hissed for him to shut up, but the sound grew, wet and tearing as if something inside his chest was splitting apart. The guards didn't rush in, they didn't even move, they froze like men hearing the toll of a bell they'd prayed would never ring again. Then came the sound that would mark the rock forever. A howl that split the silence in two. It was no animal, no man. It was something caught in between, too loud, too ragged, too full of rage to belong to a wolf, too primal, too ancient to belong to a man. It shook the bars, it rattled the bolts, it made the lights flicker, and every inmate on the block pressed back against the concrete, hearts hammering. In terror, the coughing man was no longer a man at all. His fingers curled around the bars of his cell, not fingers anymore, but claws black and sharp. His teeth spilled past his lips like ivory knives. His eyes glowed with a hunger that made the other prisoners shrink away, even the ones who had once killed without hesitation. The guards didn't try to drag him out. They knew better. They slammed iron doors shut across the block and let the monster writhe in his cage, snarling and tearing at the stone. Some prisoners screamed for help, others prayed, and a few watched with fascination like they had always known this day would come. But the bars weren't enough. Steel groaned. The cell rattled, and then silence. The kind of silence that isn't empty but waiting, coiled. When the next sound came, it wasn't human. A claw tearing through concrete, a growl vibrating through every bone in the block. The rock was supposed to be escape-proof, but no one had considered what would happen if the inmates weren't trying to get out. What if they were trying to get loose? That night, the first howl rang across the bay. Fishermen out on the water swore they heard it echo through the fog. In the city, some claimed it was just the wind, but those who lived close to the shore, the ones who never spoke of it again, knew better. They knew something inside Alcatraz had finally woken, and for the men trapped inside the cell block, it was only the beginning. The moon rose slow and merciless, dragging its pale light across the black waters of the bay until it reached the fortress island. The rock gleamed like a tombstone. Inside, the air turned fever-hot, the walls humming as if the building itself anticipated what was coming. Prisoners tried to sleep, but sleep had no place here. They tossed, shivered, muttered prayers. Some clutched their stomachs as if something inside clawed at them from within. Others pressed their foreheads to the cold bars, sweat dripping, teeth chattering. Then it began. Bones snapped like branches underfoot, skin split and reknit. Screams turned to roars. A wave of convulsions rippled through the cell block, inmate after inmate collapsing and rising again. No longer human, no longer men. Their bodies warped, jaws stretching into savage muzzles, hands twisting into claws, eyes burning with lunar fire. The prison echoed with the music of horror. Cracking joints, rending flesh, the howls of a dozen monsters locked in steel coffins too small to contain them. The guards knew the signs. The moment the first cell rang with animal screams, klaxons blared, heavy shutters slammed down over doors. Floodlights turned red. They moved with grim efficiency, silver revolvers in hand, rifles tipped with cold steel that glimmered unnaturally in the light. Alcatraz wasn't just a penitentiary, it was a laboratory in containment. The prisoners who didn't change shrank back into corners, eyes wide, knuckles white as the men they had eaten with, fought with, cursed with, became beasts in front of them. The stink of blood and sweat filled the corridors. The transformed threw themselves against the bars, bending them with inhuman strength. Screeches of metal filled the block. Every slam of claw and muscle promised the cages would not last until dawn, and then one did break. A shriek of iron, sparks, a door wrenched loose and hurled across the floor. The thing that stepped out no longer carried the face of the man it once was. Its fur bristled with blood, its jaws snapped with hunger, and when it threw its head back, the howl that tore through the prison shook even the guards' steel resolve. Gunfire erupted, silver rounds cracked the air, the creature shrieked and thrashed, but it did not fall. More doors bent, more beasts broke loose. In seconds, the block was chaos. Muzzle flashes, claws raking through flesh, guards dragged screaming across stone. It was not a prison anymore. It was a hunting ground. Outside, the fog thickened, rolling across the bay like a shroud. Fishermen would later swear the moon that night looked wrong. Too red, too swollen, as if it fed on the blood spilling inside those walls, and for the men still human, trapped. In their cages, the choice was a nightmare. Remain in their cells and pray the bars held, or cry out to the guards, drawing attention that might bring salvation, or slaughter. The rock had changed. The rock had woken. And under that full moon, the legend of Alcatraz was rewritten in claws and screams. The prison block was no longer a cage. It was a slaughterhouse. Alarms wailed across Alcatraz, red lights spinning shadows against walls slick with blood. Guards fired wildly into the dark, their silver rounds sparking as they tore through flesh, but the monsters didn't fall fast enough. For every body that dropped, two more emerged, dragging themselves free from twisted steel. The hallways became hunting grounds. Men scrambled over each other to reach locked doors, screaming to be let out, only to realize freedom meant nothing when the predators already prowled the corridors. Chains rattled overhead as floodlights swung, throwing the shapes of fur and claws across the stone. One beast slammed a guard so hard into the bars his bones snapped like twigs. Another leapt from the second tier, landing in a spray of blood, its claws carving 3 men apart before the fourth even had time to scream. The air filled with copper and smoke, prayers and curses, the chaos of men trapped in an iron labyrinth that now belonged to wolves. And yet, amidst the carnage, there was something worse. The beasts weren't killing mindlessly. They hunted with purpose. They stalked, circled, herded their prey into corners. These weren't inmates anymore. They were predators who had spent months, years learning every crack in the rock. Now those lessons turned lethal. The guards fell back, forming choke points, unleashing fire in desperate lines. But the silver rounds ran low. Once they were gone, nothing stopped the tide. Panic spread like infection. Some guards dropped their weapons and ran, others locked themselves in control rooms praying the doors would hold. And the prisoners, the ones still human, were caught between two hells. If they stayed in their cells, they risked being torn apart when the bars gave way. If they fled, they ran straight into the jaws of the pack. The howls rolled through the prison like signals, echoing from block to block, a language of hunger and fury. The beasts were calling to each other, coordinating. No one had ever escaped Alcatraz. That night, it wasn't about escaping the island. It was about surviving the hunt. Deep in the cell blocks, one inmate pressed his face against the bars, whispering over and over, "This is why they built it here. This is why no one leaves." His voice cracked into a sob just as a shadow moved across his cell, fur brushing the light. Then the screaming began again. Outside, the fog swallowed the island whole. To those on the water, the sound of gunfire was muffled, but the howls carried. Clearly, they rose above the tide, louder than the gulls, louder than the waves, until the whole bay seemed to quake with it. Inside the rock, man and monster were no longer separate. They were tangled in blood, in stone, in the curse of the full moon. And for the survivors, there was no dawn, only the nightmare of trying to outlast it. By dawn, Alcatraz was no longer a prison. It was a charnel house. The corridors were painted red, the cell blocks littered with twisted bodies, some human, some not. Smoke hung in the air, heavy with the stench of gunpowder, blood, and wet fur. The survivors, guards, a handful of inmates, huddled in silence, their eyes vacant, their ears still ringing with howls that had only just faded. But the nightmare wasn't over. Not for them, not for the rock. Because the government had always known this day would come. The files had been marked restricted containment protocols. The warden had read them in silence, his hands trembling as he locked them back into a safe no one was meant to open. The truth was simple and damning. Alcatraz wasn't just about keeping criminals away from the world. It was about keeping something monstrous away from us all. And now, containment had failed. The boats didn't come at first. The survivors waited, but no ferries arrived with fresh guards, no doctors with stretchers, no rescue parties, only silence and fog. It was as though the island had already been abandoned by the outside world. When ships finally appeared, they weren't rescue craft. They were military. Men in gas masks and black coats stormed the island, rifles gleaming with silver, flamethrowers strapped to their backs. They marched through the prison like an exorcism, burning the bodies, torching the cells, sealing the wounds of the rock in fire. The survivors were not saved. They were silenced one by one. They were lined up in the yard, handed papers to sign, agreements, confessions, lies. The prison riot got out of hand. A fire spread. There were no monsters here, no howls in the dark, only men gone mad. Those who refused to sign disappeared. The official story was written that very week. Alcatraz was shutting down. Too expensive, too crumbling, too outdated. That was the headline the papers printed. But the real reason was scorched into the stone itself, hidden under ash and salt water. Even the families of prisoners were fed lies. Death notices arrived, stamped with vague explanations. The bodies were never returned. Sealed coffins, shipped quietly, buried fast. For decades after, the island sat abandoned, a relic, a ruin. Tourists would eventually walk its halls, snapping photos, marveling at the legend of escape attempts in cold seas. But the walls still remember. And if you listen close enough, they'll tell you the truth. Because not everything was destroyed. Not every howl was silenced. There are whispers among the Coast Guard, among fishermen who steer wide of the island during certain tides. They say the fire didn't kill them all, that some survived. That even now in the deepest tunnels beneath the rock, something still waits for the next full moon. The government closed Alcatraz because the monsters couldn't be controlled anymore. And when control fails, the only option left is to bury the truth. Tourists come now with day passes and paper wristbands, laughing in the wind as the ferry noses through the chop. They snap photos of the gulls, of the lighthouse, of the cruel geometry of the cell blocks. A ranger smiles and recites the official script. Budget cuts, infrastructure rot, the famous escape that wasn't. The story fits in a brochure. It does not fit in the bones of the island, because the rock remembers. Every step inside is a throat of stone swallowing echoes that never learned they were supposed to die. Metal sweats, air chills for no reason. In the utility tunnels where concrete ribs the dark, the drip of water counts time in a language the living forgot. The old doors still hang there, pitted, warped, bearing scratches where no tool should have reached. On certain bars, silver stains refuse to tarnish. On certain nights, the guide's radio skitters with a low interference that isn't weather and isn't static. It trembles like breath. They closed Alcatraz on paper, but a paper closure doesn't silence a blood right. The moon makes its own rules. Some nights, fog takes the island and the city disappears, as if the past has pulled a hood over the present's head. A full moon lifts itself out of the bay like an oath being remembered. Out on the parade ground, wind combs the grass in one direction, as if something large is moving where nothing is supposed to move. The lighthouse glass winks once, twice a slow blink, and then the sound starts. Not loud, not yet. Just a thin line of a note, the wire of a cello before the bow. A noise too clean to be wind, too long to be a gull, too patient to be a man. The docents lock early on those nights. They don't. Say why? The last ferry leaves with more urgency than a schedule can explain. In the gift shop, someone always forgets to count the keychains. On the pier, the ropes slap the cleats like nervous hands. Across the water, windows in the sunset and the Presidio and the marina glow with ordinary life. Dinners are plated, children fight sleep, radios hum. No one looks out the window at the correct moment. That is how a city survives its legends. It learns to look away at the right times. But the fishermen don't look away. They're the ones who work the margins. When tide stacks against current, when moon pulls at blood, they keep their distance and listen. They know the story of the soldiers who came in masks and left with empty stretchers. They know the names scratched onto the breakwater by men who never got their coffins back. They know that if you cut your engine and hold your breath, you can hear Alcatraz checking the horizon with a voice that doesn't need lungs in the tunnels. There are places where the concrete buckles like something underneath is flexing. In the chapel, dust lies in a pattern that looks like paw prints, except there are too many joints, too many claws. In the infirmary, a steel tray rattles on its own once, a memory of operating lights and silver that burned flesh back into men long enough to last until dawn, a mercy, a cruelty. Sometimes they are the same thing, A handful of survivors made it off the island in that final year. They were made to sign, and for the ones who would not sign, the sea was asked to take dictation. But ink isn't a cure. Secrets ferment. One of those men, old now, nurses a throat scar and a quiet hatred of bright nights. When the moon is fat, he sleeps in a bathtub with the shower running cold. The way the guards taught him. It doesn't stop the dreams. In the dreams, the keys rattle and do not open anything that matters. So why did they really shut it down? Because a prison works until it doesn't. Because stone is strong until it remembers the ocean taught it how to crumble. Because men wore out, and doors wore thin, and the moon never tires of the work it was born to do. They closed Alcatraz, because it was not a prison anymore. It was a threshold, and thresholds don't hold. They let things through. The ferry wakes the water with its return, and the island shrinks into fog again, pretending to be a rock instead of a story. The lighthouse stares at nothing and sees everything somewhere inside. Something drags one claw along concrete in a line you could mistake for boredom if you didn't know hunger makes the same sound. Tonight will be clear. The tide will turn late. The moon will arrive like a confession you couldn't hold back any longer. If you stand on the shore and listen, really listen, you'll hear it. Not the first howl, not the loudest, the last one, the one that proves an ending isn't an ending at all. It's an echo deciding what to become next, and the rock will answer. And for those who hunger for more, step deeper into the shadows with our ultimate werewolf horror playlist, linked in the description below. In the world of horror, the scariest things happen when you least expect them, and trust me, you don't want to be left in the dark. Welcome to the darkness.